This is the Good Fire Podcast. Stories of Indigenous fire stewardship, cultural empowerment, and environmental integrity. Hey everybody, welcome to Good Fire. My name is Matthew Kristoff.
And I'm Amy Cardinal Christianson, and we're here to share stories of Indigenous fire stewardship.
So over the next few episodes, we're going to be talking with Indigenous researchers and Indigenous fire practitioners about what they're doing and how they're trying to get Indigenous burning back on the land.
So this podcast is sponsored by the Canadian Partnership for Wildland Fire Science, with support from the California Indian Water Commission and the Firesticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation. On this episode, we're going to talk to Oliver Costello, who's from the Firesticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation, and they're an Indigenous-led network that aims to reinvigorate the use of cultural burning by facilitating cultural learning pathways to fire and land management in Australia.
Lots to learn. Let's do this.
Yeah.
You want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Oliver?
Yeah, hi, my name's Oliver Costello. I'm a Bundjalung man from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales on the east coast of Australia. And I just also like to start firstly by acknowledging country, like paying elders to past, present and future here where I am, but also wherever you can hear me as well. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, of course. This is awesome.
Yeah, we're super excited to talk about you. So, Oliver, you are now the director of the Firesticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation. So I'm just wondering, for people maybe who've never heard of Firesticks, can you just tell us a little bit about the work that you guys do over in Australia?
Yeah, sure. So the Firesticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation it's only been legally incorporated for about a year, but we've been operating sort of under the Firesticks banner for about 10 years. And some of my colleagues that I've worked with have been in this space for much longer. And I guess Firesticks is really, I sort of hatched it out of a leadership program I was doing when I was at university. And at that time, it was really about seeing what's going on and then looking at how we connect people and sort of start to use fire as a methodology for bringing community together, with the idea, the aim, I guess, of reintroducing and also building recognition around cultural fire management, because in some parts of Australia, people have been able to maintain or sort of reinvigorate fire, and it's really largely been dependent on, the access to country and the impacts of colonization. So particularly where I am on sort of, southeast of Australia, really heavily impacted, and a lot of restricted access to land for a long time. So a lot of Aboriginal communities have, I guess, their cultural fire practice has declined or become misappropriated. So it's really, the Firesticks is really just trying to build that recognition back into the fire management and land management space, that all people manage the land using fire and other cultural practices really effectively. And we still see a role for that now and into the future, and we really want to get people together to help us build that relationship back in the landscape for appropriate fire, and then start to, I guess, try and rebuild those, other cultural practices and pathways to really build healthy country, because the landscapes that we live in now are not just fire, but there's a lot of other things going on. They're really dysfunctional, and it's really, hard to see and hard to live in those landscapes for lots, as a cultural person, emotionally and culturally and spiritually, but also just as a lifestyle, seeing, not being able to access food resources and access places and see them in the way that they should be. So, but the other end of that as well is that a lot of our communities have been really disempowered, obviously, through that lack of access and that to land and ownership and control of land. But that's changing. We've got land rights acts and native title processes which are giving community country back again over the last 20 or 30 years. We've seen, and now people have the opportunity to manage them in a cultural way, but there's still a capacity issue there around, in a modern economy, having resources and jobs. And so we're trying to look at, we've got this real need in the environment, and we've also got this building capacity of, having land, having people with, ranges with jobs and skills, but needing to build on that. And then looking out across the landscape and seeing all that, what was our country, all this private and public land which is managed by other people, and seeing it not managed as well as it could be, and wondering, well, how can we get involved in that? And so Firesticks really starts to give us a mechanism to start to move forward into that space and look at ways to, I guess, try and solve a lot of those challenges, because we're seeing, since the last 10 years, it's really exciting, this massive shift, going from an idea and not really being able to introduce it in lots of landscapes to now being able to do it, and seeing people really rally around in community and in agencies to make it happen. So I think, there's so much potential in this work, and we're really excited to go forward with it.
Awesome.
Yeah, Oliver, you guys are really leading the way, I think, in terms of Indigenous fire stewardship. So congratulations on that first, because you were doing it when lots of us, were still just imagining.
Thank you. And, and it's very humbling to hear that, but it's like we're just following the work of our ancestors, we wouldn't have these opportunities to learn and to try and, maintain this practice if they hadn't done it for thousands of years. And that's something, I guess, reaching out across all the world, all our ancestors go back to a connection to the land where they had a law and they followed it. And unfortunately, so many of us and, through the history, of the land have become disconnected, mainly through colonising processes from others. It doesn't matter what colour you are and where you come from. At some point, people were connected to the land, and someone, pretty much broke the law and came away and took away those opportunities. So, if we understand that process, it really gives us an opportunity to build new relationships with the land, and that's a part of this methodology. It's not, because that's one of the things we came up against, early on, particularly in these southern landscapes that are highly regulated, and there's, huge fire management industries, with wildfires, and, it's a big space, and often when they, you look at the fire management books, they have some brief acknowledgement that Aboriginal people used to use fire. But they say, but that's not relevant anymore. It's, there's houses, there's assets, there's, all the knowledge is lost or whatever. And it's like, and we've always refuted that. So, no, old people, always had assets and values. They were always understood. There was different relationships and they used fire to manage that. And just because it hasn't happened, in a particular place, for the last however long, doesn't mean it can't happen in the future. And it doesn't mean that, what Captain Cook saw when he, sailed up the coast of the East Coast and saw all these fires happening, didn't mean that they burnt that same way 2,000 years ago. So people are always adapting with change, with the environment, with their values, with their social structures and kinship. And, just as, we sit here today, we have those same opportunities to understand what is country teaching us, and how do we do what we know to support that relationship with country. And fire is one of those critical tools to do that.
You were talking earlier about the restricted access. And so in Australia, like I know, like in the United States, a lot of their problem is it's all private, right? So trying to convince people to let Indigenous people burn on their land, I imagine, is a big problem. Whereas at least in Canada, it's mostly public land. So when you say restricted access, is your guys' access problems have to do with, is it public or private? And what are some of the challenges there?
It's both, really. And without going into the complexities,
okay.
And so you got, so everyone's, sometimes there's good cooperation, but essentially, you got all this disconnect, and that really restricts the ability to do the right thing. And so it's changing, but largely, and going back, along, I guess, a little while back to the sort of reserves and mission days, Aboriginal people weren't allowed to leave the mission or reserve without a pass. And so you could only, if you're trying to maintain your fire practice in New South Wales, say 50, 60 years ago, you could only do it in your mission or reserve legally. That's where a lot of, and there's still been some, continuation of cultural fire around missions and reserves where people have just sort of maintained a bit of practice, but it's often seen as arson because, people's relationships with authorities are often fairly poor, and they feel, maybe an entitlement to do it. So you've got old people, burning around the mission, and RFS turning up and putting it out, and
getting a bill after.
Yeah, and maybe not necessarily doing it in a cultural, in a holistic cultural way, but still maintaining, there's still these layers, I like to think about it, of of cultural practice. You know what I mean? Like most people, still fish. Like that live in those kind of environments where fishing is a common thing. So a lot of different people over the world still fish. But it doesn't mean they necessarily follow all the same rules, laws that the old people would have about when you can and what you can take. And so you get this deterioration in practice, and that's what we're seeing in fire management, and it's not always clear, to an outsider or an insider necessarily what they are anymore. So that's where you get a whole heap of, and that's one of the things we're trying to rebuild is, that law framework that sort of, there is right fire for country, you know what I mean? And you need to know the law, and, that local knowledge is critical about what those totems and values and kinships are of species and places, so you can burn them right. Otherwise, you're applying, broader law principles, which are really good for bridging if you don't know what the local ones are. But ideally, you're using those bridging ones to start to drill down into those finer laws, And that's what we're seeing across landscapes where, you're seeing all these Western laws and guidelines around fire really having a negative impact on our cultural framework.
Well, I can see that for sure, because I guess the goal is to do this everywhere, not just on Indigenous land, right? You want the whole thing to be Indigenous land where you can do this type of stuff, because it's beneficial to all parts of society, right? It's not just beneficial to Indigenous communities; it's beneficial for the environment and all kinds of different reasons as well. So I guess that's the ultimate goal. But I can't even imagine the red tape you got to begin to cut through to do something like that.
Yeah, even the reasons for burning Oliver was talking about, you can have neighboring reserves in Canada that neighboring First Nations that will burn for totally different reasons, and with totally different techniques. So it's really, I don't know, it is different. And I think people don't realize that, like you were talking about the complexity of burning. It's not just, go and start a fire and see what happens. There's really specific reasons, for burning. So I'm just wondering, Oliver, I have two questions that are kind of combined. So is Firesticks only in New South Wales, or are you guys kind of spread across Australia? And then what is your relationship like with the fire agencies, that you guys want to get back out burning? I'm interested in kind of the power balance and how that works.
Yeah. So we're not just, I'm based in New South Wales, and I have this big thing where I try not to be thinking about things from a state perspective, but I do. I've worked in New South Wales government for a while, and so I understand those state frameworks and stuff. But essentially, we work with groups anywhere in Australia that we have relationships with. They're mainly on the East Coast, and so a lot of the fire mentoring and a lot of the fire methodologies that helped to establish and drive the Firesticks initiative come out of Cape York. So there's a huge, body of knowledge and work that's been going up there for a long time, which has helped us to develop down here. But we've also equally been, accessing and building on knowledge from all parts of the, from lots of different communities and individuals from elsewhere. And so, we've also got a lot in Queensland, New South Wales. A bit going on in Victoria, a lot more over the last couple of years. So Victoria is really taking off, and the next National Indigenous Fire Workshop the plan is going on is looking to be in Victoria, and also in Tasmania. There's a bit going on down there. So it's mainly those East Coast states and ACT, which I kind of always think about as part of New South Wales, but it's our Australia and the Australia Capital Territory that sits in the middle of the sort of the south of New South Wales.
So the relationship with the agencies then, in Canada, we have our provincial agencies that are our fire managers. And, since fire suppression laws were enacted, now they kind of control who burns and where they burn. And we've had people jailed here for, not recently, but before, for burning, or, very heavy fines lifted done for trying to do cultural burns. So I'm just wondering, here, there's still that kind of thing, we're the experts, we're the fire agency. What's it like over there in Australia? Is there a real recognition of your guys' expertise around burning?
I think there is at levels, and it's improving. There's always been a pretty good openness for the agencies to talk to us and but they're still getting through all that regulation and policy has been very challenging, because you can have really great agency people that are like super excited and on board, but struggle with how they can do anything, and so we've been, one of the key things I guess we've been doing is running our cultural fire workshops, and engaging the agencies, and so we pretty much always say, like bring your fire truck, come along, but like we want to do it our way, and so sometimes there's a bit of tension, but often they get on board and they come along and they see fire introduced and talked about in a quite a different way, and they're often quite positive and responsive to that. So we're actually getting some really good outcomes working with the agencies, but it does vary across the regions and the states, and and it really, a lot of the time it's just really about the people, and I guess from the agencies, but also like the Royal Fire Service is pretty much a volunteer staffed kind of agency, so it has a whole heap of government staff, but then all these local brigades that are full of volunteers. So it sort of varies a bit, I guess, on like the local brigades, and most of the RFS's work is really putting out fires. Like they do hazard reduction work, but they're volunteers, so principally they're there because they want to protect their houses and they have a sense of responsibility to help other people, so other people come and help them protect their houses. That's what drives that sort of membership mainly. So for them, this kind of what we're trying to do is a bit different.
Yeah, so Oliver, do you have, so like if you wanted to go burn country with one of your nations over there, then do you need to submit a burn permit or like a burn plan to the agency? Or can you just go in New South Wales, say, and burn?
It varies. So in New South Wales, we have a few kind of exemptions, and the irony is it's easier for us to burn on private land or Aboriginal freehold land, because RFS have basically got a process around at this time of the year when fire risk is high, that you need a permit to burn, just to light a fire. But outside of that period, you don't need a permit to light a fire. You do need a permit if you're doing hazard reduction activities. But we say that we're not doing, generally speaking, we're not doing hazard reduction activity, even though you have a hazard reduction outcome. We're doing a cultural activity, and so there's another bit of legislation that sort of rural, some of the Local Land Services Act, that says that you can undertake cultural activities on rural lands and stuff.
I like that. Smart.
Yeah, so we sort of use that. Yeah, we sort of use that and say this is a cultural activity, and it's not, it's not really a hazard reduction. That's not the reason for it. It's an outcome, and we've used the hazard reduction certificate process at times, and there's benefits to it as well. But it means that there is a bit of a loophole.
You got to exploit those loopholes for sure.
Yeah, we've been using it. Yeah. But that generally, like in a lot of situations, RFS will write a hazard reduction certificate for us and get on board and come and help us and stuff. And so sometimes that's useful. The problem is that they have this environmental assessment code, which I guess mandates a whole heap of restrictions on burning. And so often maybe the first burn is no problem, but then when we want to go back and do another burn, it'll say, oh, no, that's too soon for this vegetation community or something, and it will stop us. So, and that's all, and for good reason, because, there's, I guess, a lot of inappropriate burning that goes on and develop these environmental guidelines. But the challenge is that the way we burn, a lot of the environmental impacts, the negative impacts, don't happen, and you actually get more positive impacts in the way that we burn. So those sort of precautionary, frameworks are really more because people are burning too hot, and burning at the wrong times and the wrong ignition pattern. So they're burning country in the wrong way. So you are losing species and having negative impacts, but we're not doing that. And the irony is that those restrictions are also leading to a whole heap of environmental impacts as well, because you can't once you might have a wildfire or a hazard reduction which is inappropriate for that vegetation, like the intensity or the timing or something, and then you get this mass germination of say wattle or tea tree or some kind of species which doesn't necessarily not belong there at a certain abundance, but at the abundance that it's going to be at now and into the next its life cycle is way too much. And so you're seeing whole forests basically transitioning because they have this, mass germination of this, species. And our response to that culturally would be come in and burn it in a year or 2 or 3 or whatever, and thin it out and knock them out and whatever. But because they can't burn it again for another 7 or 10 or 15 years, they can't burn it until some of those trees have pretty much matured. And then if you burn it, you're going to then start burning the canopy, or you're going to create a wildfire, successional pathway, which means you keep getting these wildfires before you can even put in a planned burn. Or you can't burn it because it's changed. There's no grass, on the ground. It's all shaded out. It starts to become like mesic or more wet rainforest. So you get all these structural changes in forests, and that's what we're seeing, particularly where I live, which is, high rainfall, high, quality soils and stuff. Things grow quick and shift around. So a lot of those grassy eucalypt forests are transitioning to sort of more wet rainforest, which is in some areas what they should be, but in other areas it's not, and it's creating unhealthy, and you're starting to lose species. And some of them are threatened and endangered species, like in northeastern bristlebird. There's only like 38 known birds left in the wild of that subpopulation, and they rely on sort of grassy systems surrounded by sort of more forested rainforest type systems as well. So they are declining, and so you're just seeing all these bad outcomes because of these regulations, and a lot of agencies know that, but they don't want to just change. They need science to, I guess, improve their thresholds, and the science is expensive and takes a long time, to develop. So we're seeing this real tension, and we just want to get on with burning our country in the way that we know is appropriate.
Yeah, one thing came to mind, kind of play devil's advocate a little bit, and I'm thinking about, say you have an Indigenous community where you guys have created those relationships with the agencies so that they're allowed to do their cultural burning, right? How do you make sure that the people doing the cultural burning are the people that actually know how to do it? Because I imagine that there's a large portion of the population that, although they know it exists and they understand the importance, they may have no idea where, when, or how to do this thing, right? So how do you
get that all the time over here. Oh, now the Indians are going to start burning everywhere.
Well, and that's the thing, because people are going to say that.
It's a worry,
and they're worried, right? They're worried that someone is going to do something stupid that they don't know how to do properly. And so how do you go about making sure, like, more to appease the agencies than anything else, to make sure that they're confident in your ability to manage yourselves? How do you make sure that only the right people that know how to do this are actually doing it?
Yeah, well, it's really tricky, and that's been one of the tensions, because you've got agencies, for different reasons, because of the fire risk, like life and property type risk, and also the environmental risk. That's been one of the biggest tensions going forward for the beginning, because, myself included, and a lot of people, when we started out this stuff, it's like we weren't as confident as we are now, and I'm still not heaps confident around lots of, I work on country, and I might be really confident or I might not be, and there's a lot of people at different levels, and guys like Victor are obviously really confident, but still always questions, sometimes, to consider. So there is a tension there, and I guess that's what we've been trying to, overcome, and our methodology is really about Indigenous-led community mentorship, and that's sort of the stuff that Victor Stevenson and Peter Marie Stanley as well have been working through with the traditional knowledge of all the pathways work, and the Campfires PhD that Pete's been working on. And originally, and sadly the two old men that they started out with, Dr. Tommy George and George Musgrave, were both given honorary doctorates for their level of knowledge and contribution in the PhD that Peter's been doing for, which is pretty much done, but not out there yet, I don't think. And so there's a whole process there where they've gone back and started to look at that passing on of knowledge, but also that bridging principles process. And so that's really what's driving a lot of our practice is, people like me and Victor are going out and trying to look at the knowledge and build, and support communities around the knowledge that they have, and start to, find those gaps if there are any. Some people are quite confident and really just need support, but some others need a lot more support to make sure that you've got people that know what they're doing and to make sure that they're the right people for country, you know what I mean? So they have those cultural connections to the land through their kinship, but also through their relationship with the land. Like they've, you know, like a lot of people have been moved off their traditional or, you know, or cultural landscapes. And so they might have that kinship to the people of the land, but they don't maybe have it to the country. They haven't spent time walking, managing the land and like accessing the cultural areas and stuff. So I guess there's some really important knowledge and relationships that need to be in place for the, you know, to have those right people for country. And then the next part of that is that confidence with the agency. So what we do often is we work with those different sort of, you know, community leaders or people on the ground that have the connections and have the knowledge, and then, you know, help to build them up and help them with the ways to build relationships and communicate with the fire agencies. And then we go out on country and we run fire workshops with them. And then they're the ones telling people about their country, burning their country, and the fire agencies are there going, oh, okay, well that's the you know, the man or the woman in the community that has that knowledge and has that authority, and then often that builds confidence, you know. And so it's not an easy thing, and that's really undervalued. It's a really good question. That's really what we're trying to do is build those confidences and those relationships, and to the point where, you know, like you know, RFS, you know, someone will be organising a workshop and they'll be like really maybe a bit edgy about it because the local people haven't been involved or whatever, and we might have to put in a call to head office or one of the state ops type people and say, oh, we're running a fire workshop, can you make sure they're all on board, you know? You know, we might say, oh, me and, you know, Ollie and Victor are going to be there or whatever, and often if you mention, you know, us or whatever, often, you know, people will be, oh, okay, you know, we'll make sure that we, you know, do the right, because I guess there's that respect now that, you know, like we haven't burnt down any houses, you know, like no one's pointing out where we've done anything wrong. You know what I mean? It's like, and you know, and essentially, like, you know, my view is that those local, you know, like I don't have cultural authority to come into someone's country and tell them how to burn. If they invite us there and they want to work with us to share knowledge and we can help, you know, build each other up and, you know, confidence and knowledge and stuff, and you know, how good is that? That's what our ancestors did for thousands of years. That's the basis of our kinship and ceremony laws all over the country, if not the world. So we're just trying to continue our practice. And essentially, you know, they have that responsibility, you know, like those local people with that connection, like that's their law to practice that fire. And so that's one of the tensions we've got, you know, people saying, oh, you need a permit. And I guess our response is, well, you know, we have a responsibility and authority to do this, so we need to meet in the middle somewhere. And we acknowledge that, you know, a lot of that authority has been diminished, you know, because of a lack of practice or confidence. But it doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility and a sense of authority, you know. And so it's a complex pathway, and that's really the kind of what, you know, the nuanced kind of place that we're trying to operate in, is to build that story up so that, you know, ideally, you know, communities all over the country and the world can maintain their cultural fire law and practice.
Awesome, yeah. So you were talking, I love the idea of mentoring that you guys do in your program there. I'm just wondering, what is the youth interest in cultural burning here? Lots of the elders or fire knowledge keepers that I work with, you know, are quite concerned that there is like a lack of youth interest in, you know, caring for the land through burning. So what's it like over there? Are you guys finding that, you know, kids want to come out and burn with you?
Yeah, well, it's like concerning because we are seeing that knowledge loss from our old people, you know, like Tommy George, and I never met George Musgrave. He was gone before I went up there, but I spent a bit of time with Tom and George, and my introduction to fire was through my mother married a old man from up in Arnhem Land, and he had fire law and he had a lot of different story, and he came and lived with us in the Blue Mountains, which is a really fire prone, you know, peri-urban sort of, you know, behind Sydney there. It's like fire is a big story there, and we're just yarning there and just looking at country, and he'd just say it's not being looked after, and you know, and he's coming from Arnhem Land, but he's coming from, you know, like sandstone country in Arnhem Land, and so he could, like Victor can go to, you know, Canada, and, you know, like people that can read country can go to all sorts, and they see things they know. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, there's, you know, gum tree and there's sandstone, and, you know, like they can see the different, resource relationships and different kinship stuff sometimes, and men's and women's places, and because they know what they look like and what they feel like, So we're losing all these old people, and we're worried about the future because there is this population, like most, I guess the majority of Aboriginal people in Australia probably are, under 35 or, something like that, or even younger. There's a big boom coming through. But what we do see is fire is this great engagement tool, and that's one of the things we've been trying to overcome, is that under the sort of current policy and safety frameworks, essentially agencies don't want people on fires unless they're firefighters, so they've been for a week-long training course, they've got experience, and that means that elders, our knowledge holders, and young people, our future, are essentially being excluded. And so that's one of the things that we always push really hard and say, this is cultural practice. This is about, how old people did this without fire trucks, without helicopters, without chainsaws, without shoes, helmets, PPE. Do you know what I mean? We know that.
Yeah, chainsaw certificates.
And it's not to say that all those things aren't important. It's just to say that that's one way of looking at it, and you develop all these safety mechanisms for risk management, and risk management's important, but our old people had risk management too. It was called knowledge, and they used it, and they didn't light fires in the wrong places at the wrong time because they had the knowledge. And how do we
heard that
overcome?
Quote from some. Sorry, Oliver. I was just going to say I heard a quote from somebody on that, and they was like, I risk my life doing this because I trust my ancestors, or, you think I risk my life doing it because I trust the knowledge of my ancestors. And I thought that was so powerful.
It's the truth. And it's and this is the thing, and this is what we want to teach people, to be present and aware, because that's what, that's one of the things that we try and teach around cultural safety, is that's where we acknowledge country and we make sure we work with the right people, always people that know the land and have the connections and stuff, because because we believe that ancestors are there with you, then they look after you, you smoke yourself, you get, you don't bring bad spirits and bad energy into other places. And some people don't believe in that, but even if you just think about it at a superficial level and just go, well, people are trying to basically be aware, and actually manage risk, and you see that when you do those things, you can burn, and you can do a whole heap of things in a different way. So we're trying to work through that in a meet where we can, and obviously, you want to take reduced risk, and a lot of those risk frameworks are developed because of wildfires and burning in hot and burning too hot and stuff. But we're not doing that. We're talking about basically burning grass and leaves when it's pretty cool, just as our old people did. So let's not get too carried away. And back to the youth stories. What a great, and so you go from this sort of essentially a military operation to a community event where you have old people and young people sharing knowledge, and the kids get to go out and burn stuff, which is super exciting. You know what I mean? So
what
there's
kid
a potential,
doesn't like fire?
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to teach them cultural fire law, because it's you don't just go and light fires in the landscape. You don't do it the wrong way, because then you're breaking your law, your cultural law, your ancestors and the law of the land. You teach them the right way, how to light a fire, how to make fire with Firesticks or, flint, whatever, and go, how amazing is that to be able to make fire? Do you know what I mean? It's a pretty powerful thing. People take it for granted now. But
for sure.
For thousands of years, people didn't take it for granted. It was that was someone, if someone can make fire, then they've got knowledge and authority, because of the risk of it as well. And so you teach people how to make fire, and you teach kids how to light a campfire, which is that's all fire law. And then it's then after that, when they get a bit older and they know how to do they're not running around using fire the wrong way. They know how to make fire. They know how to light it, make a campfire and look after it for the right fire, to cook something, to heat, to do whatever you're doing, smoke. They know how to moderate and use a fire the right way. Same as in the landscape. Then they might start to learn how to burn around their house or their camp. Yeah. And then they might start to learn how to burn country. And there's all these steps, and that's what we want to. That's my kids ever since they're 3 months old, been on fires. I took my daughter Charlie, out to the first year I went to the fire workshops in Cape York. Took her up there, and people probably a bit, but it's this is they need to learn. They need to feel comfortable and understand this law. And it's not like now we've become oh, we'll send them to school or you'll do a training course. It's like, no, our old people didn't do that. You just learnt by experience and mentorship. And that's so it's not like you're learning something. It's like you know it already. It's a different methodology. And that's what I call cultural learning pathways. They're actually just providing the experiences for people. And it doesn't mean everyone's going to get it, but it means that you're not going to learn more until you get it. And so you won't progress with your knowledge and authority. And there's plenty of societies, definitely there's plenty of laws and cultural stories around, in my community that go back thousands of years about people that don't listen, people that break the law. They've always been around. There's plenty of lazy people, but they're not the people that can travel for days to a ceremony and burn and look and eat and look after land and be in other people's country and know who to talk to and get through and follow the law. Like, they're the people lazing around the camp waiting to get fed. They don't know much, and that's the same thing. There's still people will still get looked after, and we still have to maintain, that looking after our family. But the only people that have authority are the people that know stuff, and that's what's shifted in our society today. Is the authority has been given to people that don't know, instead of the people that do, and that's what we've got to overcome. Just because you get a job with a government agency, suddenly you become a consent authority over all these things, even if you don't know what you're doing.
I love
that. You've got the job, and then you've got someone that actually knows what they're doing, having to go get a permit from someone that doesn't know. And so we've got to shift that in a respectful way. We don't want to undermine.
Sorry, Oliver, here we have 30-year firefighters on the fire line that they say they're getting bossed around by a first-year university grad, student that just graduated. And it's like, what?
Oh, yeah.
Like our Indigenous firefighters, but they're still at a low level because they don't have the Western education to boost them up.
I can see that. Well, yeah, it's interesting to see that so many people they see fire as, they're fearful of it, right? And it's good to have a healthy fear of a destructive power like that, but it's also a tool to be used just like, you know what I mean? A power saw in the wrong hands is terrifying too, but also it can build a lot of awesome stuff. So it's like you said, right? As soon as you build that knowledge and you understand, use it as a tool, then all of a sudden it opens up all kinds of doors, and it's not something to be feared and just something to be understood. Like any other tool.
Oliver, I want to link it back to what you said in the very beginning here about community health. And to me, that's one of my favorite things about fire is, the impact that you see in the community, or not just in the landscape, but, in people and their pride for their culture and, to carry out cultural practices and even, and just getting people back out and active on the land. So I'm wondering if you can just, speak a bit to that and how you've seen the Firesticks Alliance, improve, I guess, just health with some of your Indigenous people there.
Yeah. Well, it comes back to, and it can sound like a bit of a cliche, like healthy country, healthy people, but it's a real thing because we believe that we're a part of country, it's everything, there's this connection, like what we eat and, and our shelter, all the relationships to the land, they're tangible things. And so all those tangible things, have intangible values too. And so what we find is that, obviously if you're walking on country, and then when you're out there, you might be, accessing a bit of, bush tucker and some medicine and keeping fit, moving around, you're going to be a bit healthier. If you're spiritually and culturally and mentally kind of, being rewarded. So, teaching someone how to, when I first, started learning how to make fire, and even now when it works, you have this sense of self-esteem and positive, it's like, oh, I can do this and I can do that. And so the more you learn, that's what we see in this space, the more, you go to new places and you learn new things, and you sit around a campfire with all these people from, all from different cities and towns, and you think, and a ceremony place that our ancestors used to go to, and it's think, we're in the same place that our ancestors used to do this, we're like Bunjalung, Gubbi Gubbi, Waka Waka, Jugga, or whatever, all these different clan groups who these days are all, modern sort of, a lot of the Western imposed frameworks, everyone's sort of seen to be really different because we have different language and we have different culture, but we're also connected. And so if you understand that same thing with country, it's like there's all these connections that we have. And by practicing our culture and our fire, not only do you see the plant maybe come back, or the other plant or the animal come back or be more healthy, you're part of that, and then maybe you can eat harvest or collect or whatever that, or maybe you can show other people and teach someone, so you get this self-esteem out of it. So you're seeing this really like tangible reciprocal relationship between the fire practice, but also not just I, to be honest, didn't set out to do all this work because I wanted to burn things. I did it because I wanted to see healthy people and healthy country. I wanted to see ways of having, just as old people had, they had a resource economy. They were linked to the land. They weren't, it wasn't to where all the money was in the town, or where the new extraction industry, whether it was mining or forestry or whatever it was. They were where the food was and where the lifestyle was, Yeah. And so that's where a lot of our people still are. They're still spread out all over the landscapes, but the modern economy has left them behind because it doesn't value those things. It doesn't value the role that old people played in burning and in ceremony and being able to move things around the landscape and keep the landscape healthy, because that actually means you've got clean water. It actually means you've got clean air. It actually means you've got safety because you don't have wildfires. You actually have all these really important functions that
totally
in the Western economy costs billions of dollars. They spend billions of dollars, and instead of giving it to the people that actually have a responsibility to look after land, they give it to insurance companies and all these fire agencies that fight fire. They don't use that respect for fire and actually use fire as a part of their practice for the land.
Yeah.
So all these economies are actually driving in the wrong direction. That's why I got involved, because I want economies to be driving in the right direction, which is about regenerative, sustainable relationship to the land, the way our old people lived. And it doesn't mean that we have to go back and live, in what people call a primitive sense, which I think is probably a more highly evolved way of living in the land, like just being able to hang out and eat great things and have a great lifestyle. And basically all you do all the time is like dance, catch up with people. You know what I mean? Like all those things that people say, this is really, they're actually like what people want to do.
Totally.
Like what they work all day, all their lives to be able to go fishing and hunting and, camping, like all the artistic pursuits. And, it's like they're living, and they actually know how to do it all. They don't rely on all this technology. They're not de-evolving as we are now. Anyway, it's a big tangent, but basically you can see that there is
relevant,
this health relationship, being able to, tune into the land, do what needs to be done. It makes you feel healthier. It inspires other people as well, and it's actually, to be honest, like if we don't work this out, I'm not sure how long, human civilization can survive in this planet, because at the moment, all this mismanagement of the land is actually killing the land, and eventually, that's what happens. If you don't look after your land in the old way, when you only had, maybe you might, your tribal area might be a few hundred or a few thousand kilometres square or whatever it is. If you muck that up, then you've got to go to your neighbour's place and steal his food or trade or barter or whatever you're going to, you've got to, and that's what's happening now. We're relying, global economy is relying. So communities that live in certain areas can have trashed their landscape, but because of some other economy, they can survive. But at some point, it's all finite. At some point, it's going to go the other way, and that's why it's so important to get all those ecosystem functions, all that cultural practice back in, so we can actually start to, have a sustainable future that incorporates everything that people love, but does it in a sustainable way. You can't keep
totally
taking and taking. And that's the first principle of every law that I learned from every Aboriginal community is you don't take more than you give.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's interesting that Western society, we see ourselves as somehow separate from nature, separate from the wilderness, and it's an interesting thought that I've been having myself recently, is that somehow we see ourselves as, like, I don't know if it's better than or different than or other than the natural world, right? Where the truth is, like you were saying, we are of the natural world. We are a part of it. Like, to pretend that we're somehow like aliens from outer space that came in and we're like invasive somehow.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you look at the way we've lived our lives in the Western world, we do treat it that way. We do treat it as we're an invasive species just trying to consume and
then
not
go to Mars.
And go to Mars. Yeah, just like, consume up all the resources and then move on.
Yeah.
But it's super fascinating to see communities that can live with the land and communicate with it and make sure that there's sustainability for all things, not just for, mankind, right? So it's interesting that I don't know how to word it, but that cooperation with people and nature, it's a natural thing, right? Like it really should be happening and can be happening, but it's interesting to see how far away we've gotten as a Western society. But
yeah, one thing that's crazy to me is like every Indigenous person I talk to, and myself included, like I'm terrified of climate change.
Yeah.
Like when I see it, I
think
like
we should
you
be,
know,
right?
yeah.
Like that's the healthy.
But lots of people aren't, and that's the thing, you know, that shows that disconnect from nature, because every elder I go and talk to about cultural burning talks about climate change. Mm-hmm. And, you know, because like Oliver was saying, they have that connection with what they see around them. Yeah. Like even, you know, the one guy was telling me by spruce needles on trees, he can tell like, you know, what the humidity levels are and stuff. And anyways, it's amazing, the knowledge. And yeah, we don't look around very much. Definitely.
Well, it's just weird that we somehow see ourselves as separate from nature when we're not. We are of nature. We've communicated with nature for hundreds of thousands of years and interacted with it and been sustainable with it. Mm-hmm. And now suddenly we think, well, we better take ours and get out of here. And it's like, it's very odd. Yeah.
Well, that's colonization, right? It's that and capitalism. Sorry, Oliver, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you break it down, it's so obvious. Like, you know, we breathe in air, you know, oxygen, trees make that, you know, we breathe out carbon dioxide, they need that. You know, like there's these reciprocal relationships, you know, like
it's weird how
we
it
eat things
out.
And we have, you know, byproducts and that helps things grow. You know, it's like we're actually, you know, like at a very physical level, we're actually dependent on each other.
Totally.
You know what I mean? And so somehow there's that loss of knowledge, like people have become removed. And our old people knew that. Like they didn't have all this technology and science in a way that it is today, but they knew these things. They knew that we had these reciprocal relationships between things, you know, like there is kinship between plants and animals and people, you know, because we're all actually, you know, at very, you know, like, you know, scientific biophysical levels, we're actually all very similar. Yeah. We actually have similar processes and relationships and dependencies. Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of that, you know, like when you do fire, and one of those critical things is understanding some of that kinship law, like what like species go together and where they belong, like what's the families in the communities, and, you know, and like different, you know, like every Aboriginal community that has, like, say, koalas, you know, and here we call them Burrubi, they have a relationship with the Burrubi, but it changes because for some people, they don't eat the Burrubi. You know, some individuals, some whole communities, they won't eat Burrubi because, you know, it's a totem for them as an individual or them as a community. So, and for others, they will. And then they also have different uses, you know. So people that, like, live maybe on the coast that have heaps of, like, sea proteins are probably less likely or less dependent to eat things like Burrubis on the coast, because they're like, oh, we've got all this other stuff, you know, and particularly, you know, when you go all over the country, you know, you see these different relationships. So when it comes to introducing fire or your, like, other, like, cultural practices, you know, like there's certain things that you do for certain species and places and stuff, they change because people have different relationships. But so all that knowledge, when that knowledge is lost, you forget that, oh, this is what you do, you know, and this is how you do it, and this is what needs to be done, and that's what needs to be revived, is those relationships between things, and go, okay, because if you have a whole community that doesn't eat something, well, it becomes an increase area for that species. You know, it's an abundance. Whenever you go there, they're abundant, and that's why, you know, one of the reasons why people, these people, they're the koala people. There's koalas everywhere, you know, and you go, you know, and so, and it's like they're the first, like, people talk, you know, like in Australia say, oh, Royal National Park was the first national park in Australia. You know, and I think you guys have got, is it Yosemite or Yellowstone or one of those ones, you know, and it's like, no, old people had these protected areas for thousands of years. They were the increased sites. So certain places, you know, like there's stories we have at home, you know, like the black bean boogum, you know, there's like it's a big, looks like a big pea. It grows on a big rainforest tree, and it's along the creeks and rivers. And old people used to move them around. And certain, like in the source of that population, where you know, they might have planted the first bean or whatever, you don't take them from there, you know, and you don't, you know, at certain times you don't hunt, or you don't, when it's a hunting time, you don't take things particular, you know, like age or the first, you know, like let the first ones through. There's all these laws that we have, which are all about protecting areas, protecting species, and maintaining those areas of abundance and those abundance stories, which is so critical.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Oliver, too, I think we're just going to start to wrap up here, but I wanted to know, like, I'm sure with your work with Firesticks and, just working in communities, you've probably encountered, had some really memorable moments and stuff. So I'm just wondering, like, what has been one of your, like, favorite memories or your favorite stories, working with communities about cultural burning? Sorry, that puts you on the spot. Yeah, think of it now, Oliver.
I guess one of the things that it's a kind of a long story, but I'll try and keep it short. Is that back in July we held the National Indigenous Fire Workshop in Nowra, which is on the south coast of New South Wales, and it was the first time that those workshops started with old people up in Cape York, and they sort of got bigger and bigger and bigger. I think they started out, there was probably half a dozen people, and then and they start getting up to 100 people going to a remote location in Cape York from all over Australia, and turning up and camping and burning and doing all this stuff together. And then back in July we had this first time out of sorry I'm getting called.
Technology interrupting again.
The phone would not.
No.
That's what we get for living in a Western society.
Yeah, that is true. They can get a hold of you wherever.
How to get rid of that? Oh, sorry. So I'll try and say. So back in
we can cut that part out.
I don't know what I was up to, but back in July we held the National Indigenous Fire Workshop at Bundanon in Nowra, and it was the first time I've got lost now. Where was I?
You were just talking about how much interest has gone on. Like you were saying, there was half a dozen people, now 100.
Yeah. So the fire workshops have grown and grown and grown, and so back in July we had the last one, and we started working with it was a local men's group, and a mate of mine, Anook Noel Webster, and his son and his mates, and started looking at working with them around fire, and they were quite culturally sound young men, and really trying to revive their and learn their language and their song, their dance, and really inspiring young men. We started just they come down there, we started sort of teaching them a bit about fire and learning about fire, and then so that's been happening for maybe 18 months, 2 years max. And then they're hosting the National Indigenous Fire Workshop, and you've got 300 plus people coming, and then they're walking around as the facilitators, burning, leading this whole story, you know what I mean? And it just makes you so confident to know that there's these things that are working, and they can work. If we are building our young people up to be these cultural, learning people that can just take on knowledge and practice it, you know what I mean? And the story, there's one little story of many stories about that experience, but one was that we were setting up for the fire workshop. It was the opening day. We're getting ready for the welcome ceremony, and everyone's arriving, and this big storm comes through. It's like lightning, hail. It's and for me, I took cover, and I was like, oh, great, I can get some work done, because you're greeting people. I just got in the office, and I was just typing away, getting things done. This big, I'm checking out stuff, oh, this is amazing, it's beautiful. And I thought to myself, this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's not, you know what I mean? It's not, doesn't seem like, nothing to me. If you have this sense of connection to the land, you're always looking at what's going on, sort of thing. And the valley was filled with this golden light, and it was just magic. It was just so beautiful, and people having different reactions to it, And I said to Uncle Nook, and I said, what's going on? He said, the old people are blessing us. This story, it's like one of those local stories about, because for us, one of our teachers for fire is lightning, because it lights the land up, teaches us how to burn.
Yeah.
And I tell that story, and I talk about how unfortunately agencies put lightning strike fires out now, because the old people didn't do that. They just looked after the land, and the lightning did its law, and we did and we followed its law. And now we break law by putting it out. And I'm not saying we can do that now because the landscape's so mismanaged, but that's another story. So I tell that story, and then you see the big bit of sand where the boys are going to do the welcome and the dance. And instead of it all looking all messy, it's all smooth and beautiful because it's been rained on. And the lightning's lit this tree, and there's a tree smouldering, you know, with smoke coming out, you know. And there's just all this beautiful imagery. And this change came through the camp, you know what I mean? It's like after the storm, you know. And then the boys are, you know, you see uncles walk out onto the sand and you see his footprints. And I see that stuff and I'm just like, that's magic to me, you know what I mean? Because you start to see the whole picture, you know, all these things coming together, and then the boys walking out. So you see all the footprints on the sand, you know, and then you've got these young, you know, and some old men there, like, you know, welcoming us to that country and language, telling us that it's great that everyone's come here for the good fire and that this place is a meeting place, and it's great that everyone's come back here and we can learn. Like, this hasn't happened for 200 years or more, that people have come here to do ceremony and we're going to burn, you know. And it's just rained, everything's wet, you know. It's like we're at a fireworks shop. So the next day, people are going out for their first, because we had like 8 different workshops and you do 4 a day sort of thing. And so pretty much everyone that went out on the first day didn't get to burn. I think they might have got a few little kind of tiny little fires in that didn't go anywhere on the end of the day. But, you know, for some people, you know, they've come to burn. There's only a couple of the workshops you're going to get to burn. Even on the last day, there's an open day and you can go and do it. People are a bit frustrated maybe, you know, but that's what fire law teaches. Lightning, it teaches us patience. You know, like, you can't just burn, you know, like, you can only burn for the country. You can only burn at the right time. And, you know, the country's wet now. And then so, you know, the workshop's going on, and I'm still soaking everything up. And then on the last day, they start burning, and the fire starts to run, because now the country's ready to burn, and it's been wet before, so it's got soil moisture, you know, underneath. And so then you start having this you know, like, you actually start to understand that lightning isn't just this spiritual, symbolic thing. It actually has all these physical things it's doing, you know. And you can see how, you know, some of those trees that didn't, you know, that smouldering, they might smoulder for days, and then suddenly the country dries out and they light up and they start to burn the country, you know. So old people have been, you know, living in a place for thousands of years. They've been watching everything. They've been learning all this knowledge. And so I learnt a lot of that knowledge that I sort of knew in a way, but in a real way I started to see it in practice at this National Fire Workshop. I thought, you know, I learnt all these amazing things, you know. And that's the power of this work, is that, you know, if you're present and you're respectful, and there's so many more layers to that story, you can take in so much, and you can start to see how we can actually solve all these problems, because you know that these things, old people work them out. And there's 2 ways of learning. There's being, you know, like, through that experience where, you know, the old people will tell you a story and you see it in practice and you learn it, or you learn it the hard way, you learn it yourself, you know. And either way, there's so much knowledge to learn, there's so much work to do, and it's inspiring to see that there's all these people all over the world, I guess, that have this opportunity, whether they know it or not. They have this opportunity to come in and to be present and to learn. And if you take that way of being into any environment, any place you go into, it's such a greater way of being. And I reckon that's the way the old people carry themselves. You know, there's no way that they learnt how to live and to travel through the landscapes without that sense of being present. And that's really what everyone needs to, I think, take with them into the future is, you know, if you take that sense of respect and being present, you know, then you learn, and then you don't make mistakes. You don't do the wrong things, including, you know, the way you treat other people, the actions you take, because you're paying attention, you know. And that's the challenge, that most people are not paying attention anymore. And that's where all that disconnection comes from. You're not connected, you're not present, you're not paying attention, you know. It's just such an obvious methodology, and it's so great when you actually get to live those experiences out, as I did back in July at that workshop. And if people are keen to experience some of what I just talked about, on our website, it's www.firesticks, which is firesticks.org.au. We've got a film of the fire workshop and a report from the fire workshop that people can go on and experience, I guess, and see some of that, you know, some of that in action. And I guess the potential that can come, wherever, it can go wherever because it belongs. It's about people being connected to land and sharing that connection and people learning from that connection. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, and maybe they can come to your next workshop
Absolutely.
if they're interested. Yeah, I'm sure you have information on your website
We're
about that too.
We haven't announced the dates of the next one, but it's all pending, and we're looking at it'll be in winter in Victoria, Australia, or around there. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like June, July, August.
Probably May, June, July. We're looking at yeah.
Okay, sweet.
I'd be more
Sounds great.
specific,
Well, yeah, I just want to thank you. Pardon?
I said I would be more specific, but we'll get it out there on the website. So once we got all our ducks lined up.
Yeah, no worries. For sure. Yeah, Oliver, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about Firesticks. You can just, feel your passion for the program through the recording. And I just want to say, too, on a personal level, like how proud I am of you guys out there. For like myself as an Indigenous person here, like it's so inspiring to see what you guys have done there and, the potential that we can follow kind of your lead there. So thanks for all your work. I'm sure it hasn't been easy, but yeah, anyways.
Yeah, those stories speak for themselves. I think it's, you said it perfectly. Mm-hmm. It's awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. This was awesome.
Thanks so much for having me. And, and I guess our whole methodology is about, community mentorship, and so we'd love to come and, we'd love to come and do stuff over there with you and communities and wherever. That's the methodology. It's not something that's exclusive to Australia. It's pretty much, I see, hopefully the Firesticks Alliance being able to work wherever fire and people have that connection on country. It's really about, because it's exponential. Some of the stuff, that's, like, that I've learnt, it's taken thousands of years to learn. Some of the things that I've learned have literally happened in moments. And if we can work out ways to share that with each other really effectively and respectfully, we have the ability to share so much with each other and really, go forward exponentially and really grow. I'm really excited to see, what can come into the future in the landscapes that you work in, because I think there's obviously so much capability and story there, and it's just about how do you bring it together and harness it and unlock those harnesses that are pulling it back, and seeing it go forward in a really powerful way. So, hopefully get to spend some time.
But yeah, I think. Yeah, and I think that you guys are such a positive example that way, that you can do this and the whole country won't burn down. So, that's what I really look for inspiration from you guys there. So
it's amazing to see, agencies working with, and like you guys working well with, government agencies and stuff like that, and the cooperation there, because that's something that I think's unparalleled. You don't really see that working out as well as it sounds like it's working out down there. So hopefully, other countries can take you guys as an example and try to follow your lead.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I know Amy and I both really enjoy these conversations. They're always incredible. Thanks so much to Oliver for coming on. We really appreciate you coming on. This podcast was produced by me, Matthew Kristoff, and I have an environmental sciences podcast called Your Forest. And if you like good fire, you'll definitely like Your Forest. Please check it out on Apple, Google, Spotify, and Stitcher. And I hope you guys like it. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks a lot for listening. Take it easy.